Hey, real estate investors, welcome back. This is Jason Hartman, and today we are going to talk about cap rate, otherwise known as capitalization rate. Now, this is one of the metrics that you've probably heard a lot about as a real estate investor. People in commercial real estate commonly talk about cap rates. It's like part of the lingo. You hear this all the time. This cap rate, that cap rate, or you might hear them say something like, well, that was an 8 cap. Well, what the heck does that 8 cap? It's not a baseball cap. It's a metric for calculating return on investment. Now, I do have to tell you at the beginning of this lesson that I am not crazy about cap rates. And why am I not crazy about cap rates? Well, as we're going to talk about, it misses some really important characteristics that make income property investing awesome. Okay, so let's dive in, but because we've got to understand cap rates because so many people use them, and then we'll talk about a couple of the flaws with them. All right, so our learning objectives are: how do we calculate the cap rate or the capitalization rate? What factors make the cap rate increase? What factors make it decrease? So let's dive in and take a look at that. What are some of the key factors in terms of this capitalization rate? Well, of course, there's income. Usually that's in the form of rent, net of vacancy. You must know as a prudent real estate investor that no property is occupied 100% of the time. You always have vacancy somewhere over the years, so always plan for some vacancy in there. Expenses, the cost of managing and maintaining the property. You know, there's no interest expenses or debt service expenses here in the capitalization rate. That's not included. One of the reasons that some investors like the cap rate metric, it allows you to shop around and compare one property to another. And again, this is mostly used in commercial real estate, much more than in residential investment real estate. You can shop from one property to another, disregarding the concept of financing. But you know what? I think that's kind of flawed because the financing is such an important and beneficial part of a real estate investment. You know, I like to say that debt is my favorite 4-letter word. Now, I only mean that when it comes to income property investing. You know, I have lots of debt on my real estate. Actually, I'd like to have a lot more, but I can't really get more debt on my real estate at times. But I have no debt anywhere else. I don't have any car loans. I don't have any consumer debt. That's bad debt. But income property debt is most of the time good debt. One of the reasons for that is we get to outsource our debt to other people. I love outsourcing. You know, if you've listened to some of the other amazing courses, you know, there's a lot talked about outsourcing, you know, outsourcing different parts of your business. Well, as a real estate investor, we outsource our debts to these wonderful people called tenants. And they usually not only pay our debts for us, but if we bought a smart investment, they even pay us a little bit extra every month above and beyond our debt. Okay, so the value of the property, the total market value, and actually that's a bit misleading because cap rate is not determined by the value when you're looking to purchase a property. It's actually determined by the purchase price. Now, are value and purchase price the same thing? I don't know. You know, sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. You might overpay, or you might get a great deal and you might underpay for the property where the value is actually higher than the price. So really, that's a little bit of a misnomer as long as you're looking at an acquisition. If you already own the property, you should calculate the cap rate based on the value. But if you're buying the property, you have to calculate it based on the price that you pay. Okay, or maybe the list price to initially look at the cap rate. So how do we calculate the capitalization rate? We're going to add up all the different sources of income. In the residential investment business, this is usually pretty simple, right? It's just how much rent do you get from the tenant. But if it's an apartment complex, and I've owned several apartment complexes, you might have other sources of income. You might have vending machines, you might have laundry facilities, you might have storage units or other parking or something else that I can't even think of offhand. If it's a commercial property of a different type, you may have different types of income, okay? But usually it's just rent. It's just good old simple rent, okay? And then we subtract all of the operating expenses and divide that by the total amount invested, okay? So here is how that wonderful equation looks, okay? So you see you've got your income, net of the vacancy, your expenses, and then that's divided in terms of the property value, and that gives you the cap rate. That gives you the unleveraged return on investment for the property. And the other, I think, flaw in cap rate, it doesn't include leverage, of course, okay? And I think leverage, that debt on the property, is just a wonderful thing because it amplifies your returns. But what else does it include? You might be thinking, Jason, if I own this property and it's appreciating in value, or maybe it's even depreciating in value, hopefully not. But if it's appreciating, and that's mostly the way things go in real estate, they appreciate over time, doesn't that add to my cap rate? No, it doesn't, because cap rate doesn't factor in leverage or appreciation or any type of financing at all. It doesn't factor in the debt service component. In other words, the monthly payment on that property, okay? So what factors make the cap rate increase? Well, if rents go up, that's going to drive your top line revenue, and it's going to improve your cap rate. What if the vacancy goes down? You're more efficient. The property is occupied more often, so there's lower vacancy. That will improve your cap rate too. What if there are new revenue streams? Now, this is the way a lot of people have made money in the commercial real estate side of the business. You might acquire an apartment building, and maybe I gave that laundry example earlier. Laundry is a common one. Maybe they're not running the laundry facility very well, and you can increase revenue from laundry. Or maybe they don't have any vending machines. And I know this may sound like little stuff, but when you put it into the equation of a cap rate, and then you have that multiplier effect, it can really increase the value of your property. It's kind of surprising how this happens, okay? So what about utilities? That actually, I should have mentioned that. Why didn't I think of that at the time? Well, utilities, sometimes you can separately meter your apartment buildings or mobile homes, and you can increase revenue by charging for utilities. What about lower cost management? If you reduce your expenses, you're going to improve your cap rate. Okay, so the takeaway is, you either raise your revenue, you raise your income, or you reduce your expenses. Hopefully you do both, and then you really increase your cap rate. What about decreasing? Well, the bad news, right? If rents go down, cap rate's going to get worse. Vacancy goes up, cap rate's going to decline. It's going to be a drag on your property. Loss of revenue, maybe deferred maintenance, rehabs on properties. That's mostly considered what's called CapEx, or a capital expenditure. But if you have maintenance, that's an ongoing expense, and your cap rate and cash flow will suffer. And what if you have higher utility bills that you're not passing through to your tenants? That's going to hurt your cap rate. If your management cost is higher, same problem there. So you know where I'm going with this. The takeaway is high expenses or loss of revenue is obviously bad. So what do you look for? Are rents above, at, or below market? See, when the cap rate on a property is published at a certain amount, that may not be the actual cap rate. In fact, most of the time it's not, because you may think you're buying the property at an 8 cap, for example, but it's probably going to be worse than you think. Sometimes it's going to be better. And this is a big part of your due diligence as an investor, really looking at the rent roll for the property, the expenses, seeing if they're all reasonable, if the owner is hiding anything. And again, this really brings me back to why I love simple single-family homes, because it's really pretty simple to understand. In an apartment complex or an office building or a retail property or an industrial property, this can get really complicated. And, some of these investors, they have teams of people doing due diligence to really understand these deals. Hopefully they do. Some people aren't very careful at all, especially when they're raising money from other investors, because it's not their money, so they don't really care. And that's why I like being a direct investor and owning my own property rather than investing in some kind of fund. Remember, in my 10 commandments of successful investing, this is commandment number 3. Thou shalt maintain control. And that's why I say it's really good to be a direct investor. So is the current management trustworthy? A lot of times the property manager is stealing and you're losing money there, and that can really hurt your cap rate as well, okay? So the takeaway, of course, when evaluating a property, you've got to think of the ways you can increase your operating income and reduce your expenses, okay? So cap rate, your action items, calculate the cap rate for 5 properties based on the price and rent from Zillow along with the estimated cost. Again, when these are single-family homes, this gets pretty darn easy. Now, one of the things that I do on my website is we have all of this calculated for our investors. So we've got the cap rate listed, the expenses listed, and all of this stuff. If you're looking at properties one by one, you have to be a smart investor and know how to calculate this stuff and make sure you get the expenses right, because that will really drive your return on investment. And of course, your cap rate is just one part, just one metric in the overall return on investment. So what's your badge action? Use the template, enter the information, take a screenshot and upload it, and that will calculate your cap rate for you. That's all you have to do. Okay, we'll talk to you on the next lesson. Happy investing.